The grand auction hall smelled of old money and polished leather, a place where fortunes were exchanged with the flick of a wrist. The men seated in the front rows wore tailored suits, their shoes glinting under the chandeliers. Their wives, adorned in diamonds and silk, whispered behind manicured hands, sipping expensive champagne. This was not a place for the weak or the poor. This was a battleground where only those with wealth and power could emerge victorious. Jonathan Hayes walked in unnoticed. His boots were scuffed, his flannel shirt faded from years of hard labor under the sun. Unlike the men in the room, he carried no arrogance, only quiet determination. He was a stark contrast to the world around him, an outsider stepping into the domain of kings. He had no interest in their wealth or their status. He was here for something far more valuable. The auctioneer stood at the podium, tapping the microphone to silence the murmuring crowd. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to the finest equine auction of the year. Today, we present the strongest, fastest, and most majestic horses money can buy. Let's begin. Stable doors slid open, and the first horse trotted in, a magnificent black stallion, muscles rippling beneath its sleek coat. Gasps of admiration echoed through the hall as the wealthy bidders leaned forward, their paddles at the ready. The bidding began instantly, numbers flying higher and higher as each man sought to outdo the other. Jonathan watched with indifference. He wasn't here for this. He remained still as the first horse was sold for a staggering sum. Another horse was led in, then another, each one sparking a fresh war of wealth and ego. The men took pride in their victories, flashing smug smiles as they secured their prizes. Then a shift in the air. A new horse was led into the ring, and the reactions were different this time. Murmurs replaced excitement. The horse was thin, its coat dull and lifeless. It moved with hesitation, its ribs faintly visible beneath its skin. This was not the prize they had come for. The room, once so eager, grew quiet. "Ah, it appears we have a special case," the auctioneer said, hesitating for the first time. "This is Malachi, a former racer, but past his prime. Some difficulties in his past. We'll start the bidding at $500. Silence. Then laughter. 500. A man near the front chuckled, adjusting his cufflinks. "You should be paying us to take that thing." "I wouldn't even use it for glue." Another voice sneered. The auctioneer's smile faltered. 400 then? Another pause. Another wave of quiet amusement. No one wanted the burden. No one wanted to be associated with something so pitiful. Jonathan's fingers twitched. He saw something the others did not. Beneath the dull coat, beyond the fragile appearance, he recognized a fire that hadn't yet burned out. The horse's eyes held defiance, a flicker of strength buried beneath layers of neglect. This was not a broken creature. This was a survivor. His hand went up. The laughter stopped. Heads turned. Disbelieving eyes locked onto him. He ignored them. $400, Jonathan said, his voice steady. A beat of silence, then a scoff from the front row. "Oh, this is rich. The farmer thinks he can play with the big boys." Gregory Stanford, a man whose wealth was matched only by his arrogance, leaned back in his seat with an amused smirk. He had been the loudest among them, leading the laughter like an orchestra conductor. Now he was intrigued. "Why don't you save yourself the embarrassment and leave the bidding to the real players?" Jonathan didn't answer. He kept his eyes on Malachi, studying the way the horse held its head just a little too high for something supposedly worthless. 300. The auctioneer tried again. Still, no one else raised their paddle. No one wanted the risk. Jonathan took a step forward. 200. More whispers. More chuckles. This was becoming a joke to them, a spectacle for their entertainment. "Anyone else?" the auctioneer asked, scanning the room. Silence. $200, going once. Stanford leaned in, a cruel glint in his eyes. "Why waste your money, old man? Horses like that don't get second chances. They're either born winners, or they're not." Jonathan finally looked at him, and for the first time, there was something cold in his gaze. Not everything in life is decided at birth. A flicker of something, annoyance, perhaps even curiosity, crossed Stanford's face. "Going twice." The pause stretched. "Sold." The gavel slammed down, and just like that, Malachi belonged to Jonathan. Laughter and whispers followed as he walked toward the stable doors. He heard the murmured questions. Who was he? Why waste money on something so worthless? But Jonathan had never been concerned with what others thought. A stable hand approached, leading Malachi toward him. Up close, the horse's condition was worse than it had appeared from a distance. The bones were sharper, the wounds more visible. But Jonathan reached out, running a gentle hand along the animal's neck. Malachi flinched at first, but didn't pull away. There was still fight in him. As Jonathan took the reins, leading Malachi out of the auction house, the voices behind him faded. What they didn't know, what they couldn't possibly understand, was that he had not just bought a horse. He had reclaimed a piece of his past. The journey home was long, stretching across rolling fields and winding dirt roads. The sun had begun its slow descent, casting golden hues over the land. Jonathan led Malachi with patience, matching the horse's hesitant steps. The once proud racer was weak, his hooves dragging slightly, as if every step required careful calculation. The farm came into view just as the last rays of sunlight painted the sky in deep oranges and purples. A modest spread of land, nothing grand compared to the estates of the men at the auction, but it had stood for generations. Jonathan had rebuilt much of it with his own hands, brick by brick, plank by plank. It was a place of hard work, of second chances. Malachi hesitated at the entrance to the paddock, nostrils flaring, ears twitching. Jonathan waited. He had seen this before. Animals who had been abandoned, mistreated. The world had not been kind to them, and trust was not something freely given. He loosened his grip on the reins, allowing Malachi to choose whether to step forward. For a moment, the horse remained still, muscles tensed. Then, as if something unseen shifted within him, he took the first step onto the farm. Jonathan led him to the barn, where the scent of hay and aged wood lingered in the cool air. The other horses stirred in their stalls, some lifting their heads curiously, others returning to their meal. He tied Malachi to a post and set to work. The wounds on his legs were old, but not beyond healing. With practiced hands, Jonathan cleaned the cuts, his touch firm but careful. Malachi flinched at first, ears flattening, but he did not pull away. He watched Jonathan with wary eyes, studying him, waiting for something, perhaps pain, perhaps cruelty. But neither came. Only quiet patience. The food came next, a mixture of grains and fresh water set before him. At first, Malachi only sniffed, as if uncertain whether he was meant to have it. Then, hunger won over hesitation, and he began to eat. Jonathan stepped back, watching. There was something deeply satisfying in this moment, the first step in a long road ahead. But he knew the journey would not be easy. The next morning, the real work began. Jonathan rose before the sun, as he always did, pulling on his boots and stepping into the crisp morning air. The farm stirred with the sounds of waking animals, the distant low of cattle, the rustling of leaves in the wind. Malachi stood near the fence, gazing toward the horizon. Jonathan approached slowly, not yet reaching for the lead rope. Long way from the racetrack, aren't you? The horse flicked his ears, but did not move away. Jonathan leaned on the fence, watching him. You and I aren't so different, you know. His voice was calm, steady. People take one look at you and think they know your worth. Malachi shifted, muscles rippling beneath his coat. He was still too thin, but there was strength in his frame, buried, waiting. We'll start slow, Jonathan murmured, retrieving a brush from the nearby post. No rush. Malachi tensed as the brush made contact, but Jonathan continued with unhurried strokes, speaking softly. You've still got fight in you. I saw it the moment you walked into that ring. A few minutes passed before Malachi's tension eased. His head lowered slightly, no longer watching Jonathan with suspicion. The first test came when Jonathan led him to the round pen. Malachi balked at the sight, stepping back sharply, muscles coiling as if prepared to flee. Jonathan didn't push. Instead, he stood in the center, allowing Malachi to take in his surroundings. No gates locking you in this time, he said quietly. You move when you're ready. Malachi's ears twitched, his breath coming sharp and quick. Jonathan waited. Then, slowly, Malachi took one cautious step forward, then another, until he was inside the pen. Jonathan moved with him, keeping his own steps slow, measured. He raised a hand slightly, signaling for movement. Malachi hesitated, then, with a snort, began to walk. The movement was stiff, unsteady, but it was a start. Days turned into weeks. The progress was slow, but it was there. Malachi's coat grew glossier, his ribs less pronounced. His strides became more confident, his hesitations fewer. But trust was a fragile thing, and it did not come all at once. Some days were easier than others. Some days he resisted, old memories creeping in like shadows, making him skittish. Jonathan never forced him. He let Malachi set the pace, always offering a steady presence, never demanding more than the horse was willing to give. One afternoon, as the autumn sun cast long shadows across the paddock, a familiar truck pulled up the driveway. Gregory Stanford. Jonathan knew this visit was not a friendly one. Stanford stepped out, his expensive boots crunching against the gravel. He surveyed the farm with mild disdain before his gaze landed on Malachi, who stood near the fence. "Well," Stanford drawled, amusement in his tone, "looks like he hasn't keeled over yet." Jonathan didn't respond. He continued adjusting the saddle on another horse, keeping his focus on the task at hand. Stanford leaned against the fence. "What's your plan, Hayes? Think you'll turn that wreck into something worth a damn?" Jonathan met his gaze, calm but unwavering. "I don't think," he said simply. "I know." Stanford chuckled, shaking his head. "You're a stubborn man." He glanced back at Malachi. "Tell you what, I'll make you an offer. Double what you paid for him." Jonathan barely blinked. "Not for sale." Stanford sighed, feigning disappointment. "Triple, then." Jonathan's hand stilled. Slowly, he turned to face Stanford fully. "You think throwing more money at something makes it valuable?" Stanford smirked. "That's usually how it works." Jonathan stepped closer, lowering his voice just enough to cut through the air like steel. "That's where you're wrong." The silence stretched between them. Finally, Stanford pushed off the fence with a shrug. "Your loss." He cast one last glance at Malachi, then at Jonathan. "But don't expect any miracles, Hayes. Some things are just broken." He left without another word. Jonathan exhaled slowly, turning back toward Malachi. The horse had been watching the exchange, ears pricked forward. There was an understanding in his eyes, as if he knew what had just transpired. Jonathan stepped forward, placing a hand on Malachi's neck. The warmth of the horse's body, the steady rhythm of his breath. It was proof enough that Stanford was wrong. Some things weren't broken. They were just waiting for someone to believe in them. The morning of the event arrived with the crisp air of late autumn, the kind that hinted at winter's approach, but still carried the warmth of the sun's golden touch. Jonathan stood by the paddock, watching Malachi as the horse lifted his head toward the horizon, ears twitching at the distant sounds of trailers and engines rolling down the dirt roads toward the auction grounds. This would be the final test, the culmination of months of patience, trust, and relentless effort. Jonathan ran a hand down Malachi's sleek coat, feeling the strength that had returned to the once-starved body. The scars remained, faint reminders of the past, but they no longer defined him. The fire in his eyes was different now, not the hollow defiance of a beaten soul, but the quiet determination of something reborn. "Ready," Jonathan murmured. Malachi didn't flinch at the halter slipping over his head, nor did he hesitate as Jonathan led him toward the trailer. This time, he stepped in without fear, settling into the space, as if he understood that this journey was different. The auction grounds were already bustling when they arrived. Crowds gathered around the arena, murmuring about the day's prospects, the bids that would rise and fall like the tide. Among them stood the same men who had laughed at Jonathan weeks ago, the same ones who had dismissed Malachi as a wasted investment. They watched as Jonathan unloaded the horse, their smirks fading into something more curious, almost uncertain. Stanford was there, of course, his polished boots planted firmly in the dust as he leaned against the railing. He barely spared Jonathan a glance at first, but when his eyes fell upon Malachi, something in his expression shifted. Surprise. Jonathan didn't acknowledge him. He had no reason to. He led Malachi toward the warm-up arena, keeping his movements calm, methodical. This wasn't about proving a point. It wasn't about the money or the prestige. It was about Malachi, about giving him the chance he had never been afforded. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder when Jonathan mounted. A few men whispered among themselves, nudging each other as if to confirm what they were seeing. Malachi, the horse they had mocked, was about to enter the ring, not as a forgotten relic of a failed investment, but as a competitor. The announcer's voice echoed through the speakers, listing off names, pedigrees, and past performances. Malachi's name hadn't been spoken in reverence for years, but today, it was called with the same weight as any other contender. Jonathan guided him forward, feeling the steady rhythm of his strides beneath him. He was no longer hesitant, no longer wary of the space around him. He had reclaimed himself. The first test was simple, a controlled trot around the perimeter. Malachi moved with precision, his steps fluid, his muscles working in perfect harmony. The second test was harder, a series of jumps, increasing in height. Jonathan felt the slightest hesitation before the first leap, but Malachi pushed through it, clearing the obstacle with power and grace. Gasps rippled through the audience. By the third jump, there were no more murmurs of doubt, only silence, thick with something unspoken. Malachi was magnificent. Jonathan knew it. The crowd knew it. And most importantly, Malachi knew it. They reached the final stretch. Jonathan could feel the steady rise and fall of Malachi's breath. The controlled energy coiled within him. He leaned forward slightly. The signal barely perceptible, but Malachi understood. He surged forward, his speed effortless, his body a blur of raw power and unshaken resolve. They crossed the finish line, the final jump behind them, and for the briefest moment, the world stood still. Then applause. Loud, raucous applause. Jonathan dismounted, running a hand along Malachi's neck, whispering something only the horse could hear. As he turned, Stanford stood before him, the smirk gone, replaced by something unreadable. "You proved your point," he said, voice measured. Jonathan met his gaze, unflinching. "I wasn't trying to." A beat of silence. Then, a slow nod from Stanford before he stepped aside, allowing Jonathan and Malachi to walk forward, past the past, past the doubt, towards something neither of them had ever been given before. A future.